So I'll start while the organizers are just preparing the presentation. The topic for me was rather vast. It was an impulsive decision to choose this topic, I must admit. I thought I would have a lot to share. But when I sat down to actually putting things in place, I figured there would be so many things that I could possibly talk about. So instead of approaching it as a typical lawyer, identifying the problem and, thinking about a solution, delivering the solution, I thought maybe I should prepare something in a more unstructured manner. So what I'm going to share with you is pretty much unstructured information that I will try to find, a solution in, but maybe not. But the aim really is to give you some food for thought. Having said that, okay, a couple of things that I wanted to first just touch was where really are we as a country in terms of Make in India? So the two key metrics that the government of India has been constantly focusing on, one of which is the World Bank's Doing Business report. And clearly, we've been rising in the ranks. For example, we were 130 in 2017, 100 in 2018, and now 77. So something is being identified and recognized by the World Bank. Specifically, the key areas of improvement that the World Bank has noticed is construction permits, of course, very, very important for a manufacturing company. Trading across borders, again, very, very important. Starting a business, that is incorporating a company, so on and so forth. Getting credit, so access to credit, of course, without credit, how would we grow? And finally, getting electricity. This might be a surprise to some of you who possibly, focus on reading different types of media reports, but there is actually tangible information that you can read, collect, and synthesize to understand this. Second most important report that the government of India has really been focusing on is the GII index. Now, I don't know if many of you are aware of this, but this is really an index prepared by INSEAD, Cornell in the US, and WIPO. And essentially, this index comprises of two sub-indexes, which by themselves have further sub-pillars. So one is the input index and one is the output index. And that's how there is a calculation methodology, which you can read more about on their website. But essentially what I wanted to tell you is, in this global innovation index, there have been some major movements that India has made. For instance, we are almost close to that goal of being in the top 50 innovative countries. So we're about 57th now. So one very important number is ranked 6th in the number of graduates in science and engineering. While this is probably not a surprise, I think it's very important for us to consider in the larger sort of context of, global patent filings, the number of, the amount of money that is invested in R&D, apart from R&D, what is really going on, and so on. We're 5th in ease of protection of minority investors. While this may not be so important considering India is liberalized to a great extent now, but again, very, very important for foreign investors that wish to partake, albeit in a very short capacity. Third being, ease of making investments and industry or research collaboration. So we're really, moving up into the top percentile in those senses. So just to kind of view it from a little bit of a from the nosebleed seats, in a stadium. If you look at the GDP, really, India is almost touching the UK, and these are 2017 statistics in USD current prices by the IMF. We're getting close to Germany, which is the largest one in Europe, and then, of course, nowhere close to China or US. So I'm just going to focus on India, UK, Germany, and Japan for now. Now, if we look at population, really there is no comparison with any of those countries. And therefore, GDP per capita becomes important. We really are comparing ourselves then with China, which even at a higher population size has almost 4 times the GDP per capita. So really, that is a big problem. We all know 85% of the country is classified, poor, but really that number is quite poor. Now, if you look at manufacturing value added, let's compare to the UK. Our GDP sizes are pretty much similar. UK has a population of 66 million. India has researchers in the numbers of 156 million. So we have 3 times almost the number of researchers compared to the people living in the UK. Now, if we look at that and we look at the manufacturing value added, that becomes rather interesting, right? Because we are adding value of 15% compared to 9.2%. But, as you will see from my next slide, the number of patent filings are much lower. Number 2, our R&D spend. It's half of what the UK spends, as per their GDP. Now, if we compare to the larger nations, it becomes a little bit more embarrassing, because their GDP numbers are even higher. So if you look at percentage, it's a lot lower. Therefore, really, is the problem to be solved by investing a lot more money in R&D, or is it something apart from R&D? Now, if we look at, I did want to add that top line of GDP, because I think I like to compare everything with GDP and then maybe with GDP per capita. Patent filings. I mean, we're nowhere close. I'm not saying or proposing the idea that patent filings is the key to making in India or to making it in a better manner in India, but that's shocking. It's 27,985 compared to the UK, which is 53,746. Now, these include resident plus abroad filings by residents of India. I'm not including the numbers of, foreign applicants in India, which we all know is a lot higher, about 65% or so. Same way with TM filings, a lot lower in number. So we're clearly not exporting enough, not thinking about making and going out enough outside India. Because if we did, we'd probably think about protecting our marks, or perhaps, as Greg said, probably not spending wisely. Design filings, of course, design is a nascent kind of concept in India, patent and trademark have been around for a while. So possibly that's why the numbers are a little bit poor. But again, something really interesting and a lot of food for thought, how do we really grow this? Okay, so in terms of recent key developments, of course, a lot of the Indians in the room probably are well aware of these things, but I think it's still good to look at these things. So one is the introduction of the GST, of course. It's been kind of a reform in taxation in that sense, makes it a lot simplified. Implementation has been a little bit of a problem, but it seems that, we're trying to head in the right direction. Digitization, massive digitization schemes across different administrative offices, including the IPO, e-courts, taxes, incorporation, so on and so forth. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, trying to make it simpler to file for bankruptcy, trying to make it simpler to acquire companies that are going bankrupt, and therefore, sick industrial units having possibly a new lease to life. abolishment of FIPB, which was a major bureaucratic office, and now DIPP, along with different departments, really resolves all these issues. Further liberalization, as I said, massive push in infrastructure, road, railways, so on and so forth. The UDAN scheme to improve mobility, high-speed rail networks, inland waterways. So one statistic which I really, really like, and something maybe someone else has a view on that, would love to hear it, is rural electrification. So 2,800 villages are the only ones which are remaining. This is what the Indian government strategy report says. This is rather interesting to me because then possibly this idea of complete electrification by 2022 is quite possible. And then rural broadband connectivity. I mean, we've been talking about India, 500 million phones, about 80 or, 150 million smartphones sold last year. The people who bought smartphones 4 years ago, probably in their next cycle to buy smartphones. So we're rapidly connecting to the internet and probably, have become one of the top acquirers of online e-commerce, things like that. So, a lot of the things that we really want to establish in the Make in India, sort of Startup India scheme, we're really getting along. But there are still a lot of challenges. Right. So one of the things, I wanted to skip it, but I think it's important to note, is the Planning Commission, which used to be really the hallmark of independent India, the 5-year plans, if a lot of you all might remember. That was abolished. The Independence Day speech by PM Modi in 2014 was a gateway to the new mechanism that was going to be followed, which is the Niti Aayog. And the Niti Aayog has identified a lot of things in its... previous slide, please. Previous slide. Next. Thank you. So they've prepared this strategy report called New India at 75. So this is at 2022. They really want to achieve a lot of things. And I think some of these things are very important in the IP context. So Make in India and science, technology, and innovation recognized as drivers for growth. So clearly they are interested in, the government is interested in pushing IP as a major agenda item. Achieve a top 50 ranking in the GII. Of course, one of the key aspects of innovation is IP and so on. Establish an empowered body to holistically steer the management of science. So I have this idea. I mean, I do a lot of work with a lot of government institutions, universities, and so on. Money is being spent for research, but I'm not sure the researchers are well aware of how the money should be spent in the context of commercialization. I'm not sure if the government is quite clear on how IP filings should be done in the sense of commercialization. Yes, IP filings are improvement. Yes, the government is pushing PSUs to file a lot of IP and spending a lot of money, but I'm not sure if they're looking at it from a commercialization perspective. Second aspect is they're launching a lot of different funds and fund of funds through which startups are being financed. So the government does recognize that, hey, I might not have a clear idea on how to fund a startup, but maybe a fund that I fund might have a better idea. So it's rather interesting to see all of these things. Apart from that, of course, a lot of startup initiatives, about 11,130 startups recognized until July 2018. A lot of financial schemes geared towards knowledge-based, R&D focused, and technology-based startups. So, hey, a lot of push, towards the IP side of things. But I have somewhat of a next one. Yeah, so I really think, in terms of the key challenges for making in India and really how you get it right is 3 or 4 things. One, get the 3 L's right. So you got to get the law, labor, and land issue resolved. Land, 14 months to still register land, too high. Law, I mean, we have so many laws that are all over the place. For example, labor laws, really need to be codified. The government's been looking at synthesizing them into 3 or 4 different codes. Again, labor issues, again, tied in with, of course, the law, but also skilling. I really like what Tim Cook of Apple says. He says, I go to China not because it's cheap, because it stopped being cheap in the 1980s, 1990s. He says he goes there because the kind of skill that's available. In fact, in one of his interviews, he said, I'm not sure the advanced tooling that is available in China, we could fill even a room full of engineers in the US. So he says, these truckload of skilled people are available in China, and that's why we really go to China. So, a similar analogy, I think, applies to India as well. Skills India is a rather neat initiative, but I'm not sure to what extent those skills are percolating and those types of employable skills are being made. I mean, for example, let's talk about a company like Philips. I don't want to put Ms. Iyer on the spot or anything like that, but, the kind of tooling they need, the advanced skills that they need, can we really manufacture in India to the extent of which we are really thinking that Philips should, perhaps? A global behemoth like that. So that's really important, I think. And then finally, I think that collaborations really are the way to go. I want to touch upon a few case studies that I've worked on personally. And I'd love to, just share a little bit of information on the issues that were major deal breakers in these collaborations. Yeah. So one issue that I've been dealing with, and it's really rather complex on the startup front, is the confidentiality aspect. And why it's really important to consider confidentiality. What really is the definition of confidentiality? Are we copying boilerplate language and pasting those in our agreements that we share? Do we really need to, for example, think about for a minute, does that inclusion have the quality of confidence? Can during the deal-making process that be a hindrance to how we work together and collaborate? So we need to really step back and look at what we're doing with NDAs, I know it's very simple to go to Google, copy it, paste it, and just share it. It can be very simple to do that. I mean, legal probably in all your big organizations probably says, hey, you got to circulate an NDA before you discuss anything. But does that stop you from start doing work? If it is, how do we really deal with it? I don't think legal and business development should be fighting all the time just because of a simple NDA. So, there needs to be a little bit of invention here, a little bit of innovation here. Next. Okay, so one issue that I found rather interesting in recent dealings was company A is a patent owner, company B is aware that the patent is weak. To go on with the business, company A agrees to company B agrees to in-license negotiations at a standstill. So this was a possible deal breaker. Company B wanted representations as to validity, ownership, novelty, inventiveness. So company A needs to rethink that. Do they really want to do that? Is it in their best interests? Another issue was, hey, I'm going to go and sub-license these. Are you going to indemnify my sub-licensees from possible third-party infringement? Next. Next slide, please. Another interesting one was a company wanted to start making their goods by 3D printing. So they wanted to develop a 3D printer that could manufacture their goods with a company outside India. So how do we define know-how? How do we de-risk developments? How do we define the background and foreground IP? Who owns what IP at the start? How are we going to distinguish all of that? So these were major issues. Next slide, please. And then the final, next slide. Oh, previous Previous. One more previous, please. One more previous. Yeah. Now, another one, and this is the final one, because I think I'm run out of time. Company A is the owner of the IP based in the US, wishes to franchise the Indian market, approaches Company B in India to act as master franchisee. The issues at the negotiation. What will be the governing law of the contract? Typical big US companies will want the law of Delaware or something like this. How do you deal with that? Is it in the best interest of the US company to do that? I mean, you're going to utilize the mark in India. The possible infringement will be in India. We have no reciprocity with the US as far as foreign judgments are concerned. They can be easily set aside by public policy. Do we really want to have a governing law of the US? Do we really want to resolve the disputes in the US? Even though this might be against corporate strategy entirely. Secondly, what if they sub-license? What if they sub-license with the governing law of India? It's still not resolved whether two Indian parties can choose a foreign law. So again, added complication. Choice of court. Are you litigating or arbitrating? IP rights are rights in rem. Can you really arbitrate those rights? Are you going to split the disputes, royalty disputes, so on and so forth? So, these are issues that one needs to really think about when you're collaborating. There are possible a lot of deal breakers that could happen during these types of IP collaborations. And, what I think is, really what I'd like to summarize it is, to really boost this idea of make in India, one needs to start thinking about make for India. So if